This is tough. Following the Marine Band, Mickey Hart, Jimmy Buffett, President Clinton, but I wouldn't be anywhere else in the world right now. President Obama, President Clinton, members of Walter's extended family here and across America, Nancy, Kathy, and Chip, I know how proud you were to be the children of Walter and Betsy, and I want to begin by thanking you for sharing him with all the rest of us, especially my generation of journalists, for in so many ways, Walter Cronkite was also our dad. He was the godfather who showed us the way to be good journalists, good family men, and good citizens, without none of those roles canceling out the others. Also, Walter Cronkite was a seminal force in the transformation of this country. I was personally witness to that as a teenager in the remote reaches of the Great Plains. I didn't see television until I was 15 years old, and it was a small black and white set in the corner of our dining room. But it changed my life, because in many ways, Walter Cronkite and all those early pioneers lifted a lamp and showed us the wider world and allowed us to understand it more clearly and coherently, and in some cases, to leave those places and to come here. In the past several weeks, there have been so many testimonials to Walter's long and storied career, his passion for the highest standards of journalism, his love of the sea and sailing, his enthusiasm for being Walter Cronkite, for having the good life that he earned and so richly deserved. There's little that I can add to all of that. Instead, today I'd like to remember another character of this man who was born in Missouri, educated in Texas, who lived in the world, and who grew up to be the most trusted man in America by a vote of his countrymen. I'd like to commemorate his capacity for friendship that transcended cultures, generations, and yes, even competitive lines. We're witness to that in this remarkable gathering today in this room and across the country, of course, not just in the famous faces and the big names. To the end of his life, Walter also had time for a call or even lunch with the foot soldiers of CBS News, who were long removed from his daily needs. And of course, there were those legendary friendships that went beyond the workday. His University of Texas classmate, Eli Wallach, the great actor, is with us here today. My colleague and great friend, the late Gordon Manning. And of course, Andy Rooney, whose friendship with Walter went more than 65 years, back to World War II. Personally, to those of us who came along later, the quality of those friendships were lessons as important as the legacy of quality journalism. Bob Schieffer and I have been friends for 35 years, and for the rest of our lives, we'd like to have the kind of friendship that Walter and Andy had. We just can't decide who gets to play Andy Rooney. I was a beneficiary of Walter's friendship on so many occasions. Memorably, the night that NBC aired my interview with Mikhail Gorbachev, the first ever by a general secretary of the Soviet Communist Party. Immodestly, it was a big get, and I was concerned about how it would be received. As soon as the primetime hour ended, the phone rang, and the first call, and a voice said, "Well, that was magnificent." In my anxiety, I didn't immediately recognize the voice, and I said, "Who is this?" There was a roar of laughter at the other end, and the familiar voice continued, "Who is this? It's Walter Cronkite, for God's sakes. How soon they forget." No homage to Walter would be complete without paying tribute to the women in his life. Joanna at the end, of course, Marlene, who could teach Rahm Emanuel a thing or two about being chief of staff. And, of course, the memorable and utterly adorable Betsy. Meredith likes to remind me often how important Betsy was to Walter's success because she was fearless about keeping his anchorman's ego in check. There are so many Betsy stories, but Meredith's favorite was when Betsy and Walter moved from a townhouse to a high-rise. And Betsy confided to a friend that she would miss the townhouse. The friend said, "Well, of course. So many great memories." And Betsy replied matter-of-factly, "No, not that. I'll miss the backyard where I buried all those damn plaques and awards that Walter keeps getting." It was always a lift to see them out on the town, and they didn't miss much, from Toots Shor's to Broadway openings or movie premieres. When Nora Ephron opened her sweet comedy called You've Got Mail, that romantic film with Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan, Walter went up to her and gushed later, "That was terrific. Just the kind of film that we don't see often enough these days." Betsy, standing off to the side, looked at Nora and said, deadpan, "Not me. I wanted more violence, more blood and guts. Shoot 'em up. We don't get enough of those kinds of films these days." And then Betsy gave her that crinkly little lopsided smile that made her so endearing. I always thought of Walter as a journalist right out of the front page. He had a romantic idea of what it was like to be a journalist. He also had that wonderful old-fashioned attitude about New York City, after dark, a city to be used at all times. He once told me that when he was anchoring the CBS Morning News on the way to work, he would stop to have breakfast at the Copacabana in the wee hours of the morning. I thought to myself, how dashing is that? Having breakfast at the Copa. I shared that with a CBS friend who replied, knowing Walter's way with a buck, that just meant that the Copa was buying his breakfast time. To those of us who followed the era of Walter and all the great people at CBS News, and pardon me, but also the legends at NBC, Chet and David, and all of our great colleagues as well, there are constant and enduring reminders of how much we owe them. We could hold our heads high because of the high standards that they established. And Walter, as I learned personally, that was a standard and a presence that traveled very far. He'd been out of the anchor chair for some time when I went to the Middle East to report on the Israeli return of the Sinai to the Egyptians. A small group of Jewish settlers was holding out in a compound, not allowing anyone to approach. There was a kind of a general store not too far away, and as it happened, it was operated by a man who had watched me in California when he was living in Pasadena. He offered to be my intermediary. So he said on a two-way radio to the compound, "Tom Brokaw would like to interview you." There was a background buzz of Hebrew, and pardon my Goyish Yiddish accent here, but the spokesman came on and said, "So, who is Tom Brokaw?" My new friend looked at me, winked. Remember, he was a merchant. "Leave it to me." He leaned into the microphone and he said, "He's the most important and famous journalist in America." There was more Hebraic buzz in the background. And the spokesman came back and said, "Well, is he as famous and as important as Walter Cronkite?" I laughed and said to my new friend, "Radio them back." No. And he never will be. God bless you, Walter.